So I have a list of 10 cars here that over the last 20 years in Australia have barely sold. So the first car that we're starting off is the Mitsubishi 380. And if you guys don't know what a Mitsubishi 380 is, it's basically just a glorified Magna. The Mitsubishi Magna was around for years. It was around for about 15 years. It started off in the early 90s and it discontinued production in 2005 and was replaced by the Mitsubishi 380. The Mitsubishi 380 was supposed to compete with the likes of the Holden Commodore, the Ford Falcon, but it was a little bit underwhelming. It was also launched at a time where the market wasn't really favoring large sedans anymore, which was a little bit unfortunate because that was sort of the decline for the Australian sedan, like the Commodore and the Falcon. The Mitsubishi Magna was a fairly popular car and it was actually built in Australia. So it was available in Australia as the Magna, but in New Zealand and some other places in the world, it was actually called the Diamante, which is very odd. Sounds completely different to the Magna. I don't know why they decided to call it a Diamante. There were a couple of different trim levels to the Magna. There was like a more upscaled luxury version called the Verada, and obviously the VRX and stuff like that. The Rally Art came front-wheel drive, they came all-wheel drive, manual, auto. Unfortunately, when the 380 was released, it kind of flopped. Not many people bought them. People weren't as proud of the 380 like they were about the Falcon and the Commodore, even though it was actually built in Australia, it was built in Adelaide. And to be honest, it looks a bit boring and bland. Like, it looks like if you describe a car to a kid and he just draws it on a piece of paper. Like, that's how the Mitsubishi 80 was designed. So it wasn't really a looker, the interior wasn't very good, and the build quality wasn't that great either. It had really cheap plastics. The paint on them, if you guys ever see 380s driving around, most of them have really bad paint fade. So it wasn't really good at anything. It was a very middle of the range car. And to top it all off, it was also front wheel drive. So one of the many reasons as to why you buy a Falcon or a Commodore is because they're rear wheel drive. But this one, you know, front wheel drive wasn't really anything that special. Production run was very short, only lasted about 2 or 3 years. So that's the Mitsubishi 380, nothing special. Now the next car is a bit of a strange one as well, because it was a bit of a filler content car. It's called the Holden Epica. Now it is the exact antonym for epic. It is a shit car. I've had the privilege of working on one. It was absolutely horrible. It was also basically a rebadge Daewoo. They came with a few different engine options, a 4-cylinder and a 6-cylinder. And what made the 6-cylinder really weird is that it was a straight 6, but it was mounted transverse. So it's really compact in the engine bay. It's very hard to work on. And it wasn't really that special of an engine either. I mean, yeah, it's kind of cool that it has a 2.5 litre straight 6, but it's front wheel drive, you know? Much like the 380, the Epica barely sold. You hardly ever see these on the road nowadays. They have pretty bad performance. The fuel economy isn't very good. And yet again, it was a sedan released in a time where people and the market trend was sort of leaning more towards SUVs and larger cars. The sun's killing my eyes, fuck. I've had to chuck the specs on because the light coming from the window is killing my eyes. Holden started doing this in the early to mid 2000s where they would start bringing in cars that were basically just rebadged Daewoos or Chevys, and that's what they did with the Holden Epica. It's a Daewoo, like I said before. Another car that I can think of off the top of my head that's also just a rebadged Chevy, Daewoo, whatever, is the Cruise and the Craptiva. This was the sort of holy trinity, the Epica, the Craptiva, the Astra as well, and the Holden Cruise. And another thing to mention is that it didn't really fit in well in Holden's lineup. It was apparently placed between the Astra and the Commodore. So it was front wheel drive like an Astra. It had a body similar to the Commodore, but it was front wheel drive. The interior was crap. It didn't really have many features and it wasn't really that well known. Like, it didn't have a reputation of any sort, whether it was good or bad. And so it sort of was in a bit of a no man's land. And because of that, again, it flopped. It didn't sell well. You hardly ever see them on the road. So there you go, Holden Epica, very not epic. Now the next car, I actually haven't really heard of that much, surprisingly, considering I'm a little bit artistic when it comes to cars. It's called the Ford EcoSport. Oh yeah, it's just jogged my memory now. It's basically a miniature SUV. I wouldn't even call it a small SUV, it's tiny. I believe it's based on a Ford Fiesta. It's literally a Ford Fiesta that's been elongated vertically. That's about it. The interior is very lackluster. There's not much going on. Build quality was poor and it lacked interior space. That was the main complaint apparently from customers back when they were first released in 2013. And because it was based on the previous generation Ford Fiesta, the tech was outdated. The engines and transmissions were outdated. I believe they were fitted with that crappy Ford PowerShift gearbox, which were just known for being very unreliable and unsafe. But this was Ford's kind of first introduction to the small SUV segment, and it didn't really work out well. I don't believe that Ford actually sell a model like the EcoSport anymore. I know that they have the Ford Escape, they had the Ford Cougar as well, which is actually a pretty decent car. So this Ford EcoSport, it didn't really fit in anywhere. It wasn't as good as the Cougar or the Escape that came later on, and it wasn't really justified spending a little bit extra to get a lifted Fiesta in a sense. So in that case, it didn't sell very well, and you, again, hardly see them on the road nowadays. I don't think I've seen one for months, but when you see them, they stand out because they're so ugly. The next car after the Ford EcoSport on my list is the Nissan Pulsar SSS. And it's not the OG SSS with the SR20. This is the SSS that was released in 2013 and had a short production run of about 4 years. They discontinued it in 2017 due to, you've guessed it, lack of sales. It had a lot of competition. It had a lot to live up to. It had strong competition from the Golf GTI, the Hyundai i30 SR, the Ford Fiesta ST, the Focus ST. So there was a lot of competition, and the SSS came with a turbocharged 4-cylinder. You could get them with a manual, but they just weren't as good as the rest of them, and people didn't really buy them that much. I think Nissan at the time was really banking on the fact that they wanted people to feel nostalgic about the SSS Pulsar back from the early 2000s, late 90s, and people sort of forgot about it. It's a little bit of a shame because the early 90s to the start of the 2000s is where Nissan really excelled in their sports cars, and they decided to write off the Skyline, the Silvia, the SSS Pulsar, and started moving on to really boring cars like the Nissan Tiida, the Maxima, the Pathfinder, the Murano, shit like that. And so the SSS Pulsar, they were really banking on the fact that people would remember them, they'd be nostalgic. But because they cut the production of the previous N15 Pulsar SSS, people sort of forgot about it. And the newer Pulsar SSS didn't really live up to the expectations, as well as the fact that it wasn't as good in a performance-oriented way as compared to the GTI and the i30 SR and whatnot. The styling and the interior was a little bit meh. When you look at a SSS Pulsar, it doesn't really look like anything special. The headlights are like awkwardly big. It looks just like an economy box. It doesn't look like anything special. They didn't really put a lot of time and effort into making it look like a sporty hot hatch. If you got the Nissan, the 2013 SSS in an auto, you got a miserable CVT gearbox. Now, what hot hatch in recent history came with a CVT? The only car I can think of, and it's not even a hot hatch, but it's sort of performance orientated, is the newer generation WRX. The CVTs in those are so average. Like, you don't want to have a sports car with a CVT gearbox. Like a regular torque converter, 6-speed automatic is bad enough, but a CVT is not something that you want in a sporty hot hatch. You want it to be nippy, zip around traffic and stuff like that. CVT is just, it's like speaking to an older person and you have to repeat yourself a million times so they understand what you're saying, and then they finally get it, but it's too late. You've already lost your train of thought. That's what a CVT gearbox is like. So unfortunately, the SSS name was dropped in 2017 and it hasn't come back since. Hopefully Nissan can come to their senses and actually release something like this again, but I highly doubt it. It's all just crap SUVs because that's what sells. That's what it's like nowadays. There's not a lot of die-hard Nissan Triple S enthusiasts that are waiting for Nissan to release another one of these. Now the next car that I'm going to talk about is something that I completely forgot existed in the first place because you barely see them, even new ones of these. But it is the Renault Koleos, first generation specifically. I didn't even know that they had many generations because who cares about Renaults nowadays, honestly? But Renault and Nissan were basically one company. The Renault Koleos was based on a Nissan X-Trail, shared basically the same running gear. It was just a different body, different interior. Now, I don't really understand why Nissan went this way, why they went into a partnership with Renault, because the Nissan X-Trail and Nissans in general, they're sort of a mid-section car. They're not expensive, but they're not cheap either. They're just sort of somewhere in the middle. Where does Renault fall in those categories? Renault is this French company that used to make really cool cars back in 70s, 80s, 90s. But nowadays, I don't even know how they're still in business. Modern day Renaults are known for being unreliable, or just French cars in general, they're just known for being unreliable. So I can't imagine why Nissan went into a partnership with Renault. So basically, like I said before, the Koleos is based on a Nissan X-Trail, but what it says here, without the reliability. So take that as you will. The styling as well, they look very weird. Let's have a look. Car manufacturers were obsessed with plastic in the early 2000s. The Renault Koleos just looks like it doesn't have a single bit of metal inside the whole car. Big, bulbous thing, big headlights with this weird looking grille that's like split into two, and the badge is about this big. Like, I don't understand why this thing exists, but you did see them driving around quite a bit. Not so much nowadays because they're all at the junkyard, but it's a mid-size SUV that most of them were front-wheel drive. I don't even know if you could get them all-wheel drive, with a crappy 4-cylinder and a crappy auto. I don't think you can even get them with a manual. I think the early ones you could get them with a manual, but they probably started using CVTs if I had to have a guess. It says here, styling didn't appeal to Aussie tastes, which I can understand. I don't think there is a single taste in the world that the Koleos will appeal to. The interior quality felt dated and plasticky. I can see that. Nissans, I mean, weren't much better, and that's what it's based off. And poor after-sales support and resale. Now, I can definitely see that. The dealer network for Renaults is quite small in Australia, so I can definitely believe that the after-sales support was bad, and obviously the resale, because who the hell wants to buy a used Renault unless it's something cool like a Clio or a Megane RS or something like that. Now, the next car after the Renault Koleos is the Chrysler 300. Chrysler 300s were quite popular in America, but it was in the early 2000s. It was when people were still buying big sedans with big engines, but the second generation Chrysler 300C pretty much flopped. It was released in 2012, and the production ran for actually quite a long time, 9 years, up until 2021. I actually got the pleasure of driving a 300C SRT, and I think it was a great car. 6.4 litre Hemi V8. The interior is really nice. It's got big leather seats. It just is a big American land barge with a huge engine. And unfortunately, it wasn't going to perform well here because the Commodore and the Falcon also weren't performing well. So why would something that's basically the exact same but not built here sell well at all? So you could get them with a few different engine options. There was a 3-litre Pentastar or Pentastar V6, obviously the 6.4 litre Hemi, and I believe in some markets you could also get a diesel, but I don't think it was ever offered here in Australia. Obviously, they're expensive to run, regardless of if you get the V6 or the V8, but especially the V8s. And according to this website right here, they were also expensive to insure. I can sort of hazard a guess and think as to why they're expensive to insure. Probably because they're a big car, V8, you know. The one I drove was a brand new 300C SRT, and all it wanted to do was just spin the back tires. So I can see that. The fact that Chrysler was a dwindling name in the Australian market also didn't help. So says here, limited badge appeal in Australia. The Chrysler name used to be quite big in Australia. The Chrysler Grand Voyager, the minivan, you used to see quite a lot of those driving around. The PT Cruiser, say what you will about that, strange car. And a couple other cars I can't really think of off the top of my head, but the Chrysler name was dying and they decided to re-release something, and there was basically only one Chrysler product offered in the whole of Australia, and that was the 300. Obviously Chrysler falls under the Stellantis group, so with manufacturers like Alfa Romeo, Fiat, Ram, Dodge, stuff like that, but people didn't really remember Chrysler that well, and new buyers didn't even really know what a Chrysler was. If you're not really into cars, then why would you know? So that's why it was a very niche car in the Australian market, and people weren't really looking for V8 sedans anymore. They wanted fuel economy, turbocharged smaller engines started becoming more popular. So you would only really get a 300 if you were a die-hard V8 person, and there just weren't enough of them to justify keeping the 300 on sale, and so that's why it flopped. The next car is the Peugeot 407. I have absolutely no idea what that is, so I'm going to look it up. Peugeot 407. It was in Top Gear. I believe Jeremy Clarkson drove this in their Peugeot special. Strange looking car. I think the facts are sort of coming to me now telepathically. I think that the 407 was supposed to be a luxury sedan, but why on earth would you get yet another piece of shit French car when you could just go to Lexus or any of the other German cars like BMW, Mercedes, Audi and get something better? Why the hell would you want to drive around in a Peugeot? I feel like you have to have a few kangaroos loose up here to actually buy a brand new Peugeot. So let's see, why did it fail? High service and repair costs, I can see that. Limited dealer network for Peugeot as well. Unreliable electronics and finicky French engineering, I quote. So there you go. And like all other Peugeots ever, they depreciated rapidly. And like I said just before, poor dealer network and parts availability. You have to be a certain type of person in order to buy a Peugeot. And I feel like there wasn't enough of these delusional people around in order to actually go out and buy one over, like I said, a Lexus, Mercedes, BMW. So I'm not surprised that it failed. The production run actually went for a bit longer than I expected, from 2004 to 2011. But after that, Peugeot, just like every other failing car manufacturer, started releasing these cookie cutter SUVs, and none of those really do that well either. I actually don't understand how the Peugeot brand is still alive in Australia now in 2025. Next car on the list is a very weird one. It's a Fiat Fremont. It's basically just a rebadged Dodge Journey. And what that is a large SUV that was brought out by Stellantis Group. It was just another plastic fantastic SUV, nothing special. It had a very, very short production run of 3 years. When Fiat rebadged the Dodge Journey, they changed nothing except the badge, the Fiat badge, and they just took the Journey badge off and replaced it with Fremont. That's basically the only thing they did to it. According to this, it has dull performance, dated tech, and a clunky interior, so I'm guessing it was just full of plastic. It probably also didn't help that Fiat wasn't really renowned for their reliability, and so families didn't really trust it. Although, weirdly, you do see them still driving around. I feel like the Fiat Fremont is the Italian equivalent of the Holden Captiva. It's nothing special, but you still see them driving around. I'm not sure why people bought them. And there wasn't really a strong selling point over the better Japanese competitors like Toyota, Honda, stuff like that. So why would you buy a Fiat Fremont when you can buy a Prado instead? It just doesn't make sense. So because of that, the Dodge Journey didn't do well. So why would the Fiat Fremont do any good? Don't know what Stellantis Group was thinking, but it definitely didn't do well. And for that reason, it flopped in Australia. Now, the second to last car on this list is the Honda Legend. Now, if you know what a Honda Legend is, you have elite car knowledge, because the Legend was around for many, many years, and I think they did quite well in the 90s, and it had a production run of about 6 years. They released in 2006 and it went all the way to 2012. But because of their expensive price tag, they didn't do well. Why would you go and buy and spend 80, 90 grand or even 70 grand on a Honda when you could spend a very similar amount and buy an E90 BMW, a B8 A4, or even a Volkswagen for that matter. The problem with mid-range car manufacturers releasing luxury models is they don't have that brand image that people are looking for when they're spending a bunch of money on a luxury car. VW tried to do that in the early 2000s with the VW Phaeton, which is basically a W12 stuffed into a Passat, but it had its own body, its own chassis. They spent billions and billions of dollars developing it, but it didn't do well because people didn't want to spend over $120,000 on essentially a VW. Another problem that the Honda Legend had was that it was over-engineered, and because it lacked that brand prestige, it was very underappreciated. So it was a great car, but it was just priced completely out of the market. It was also released as a front-wheel drive layout. So I believe most of them were actually all-wheel drive. But again, why would you spend that amount of money on a car that's got a transverse V6? Nothing really special in that regard, when again, you could just go out and buy a BMW, Audi, Mercedes. And because of those reasons, it didn't do that well. They're a great car, great on the used market. They've depreciated quite a lot, but the low sales killed the Honda Legend. So RIP. Now the last car on the list is actually quite surprising. I didn't expect to see it here, but it is the Toyota Orion, and it had quite a long production run of about 11 years, 2006 to 2017. It's really weird because you see heaps and heaps of Orions driving around, and you'd think that it would do quite well because all it is just a rebadged Camry, but with a V6. In the early to mid 2000s, Toyota stopped putting V6s in their Camrys as much, and they started selling V6 Camrys as Orions. But unfortunately, much like a lot of other car manufacturers, they felt the brunt of large sedans not selling that well as compared to SUVs, small, mid-size and large SUVs. Not many people bought the Toyota Orion, and nothing demonstrated the lack of sales for mid to large sedans like Ford and Holden. So if Ford and Holden weren't selling, then why would Toyota sell these Toyota Orions that well? They obviously didn't. It was a bit of a strange combination because it had a great V6, 2GR, a lot of power, too much power, I'd say even for the platform. They were front wheel drive, only offered with a 6-speed automatic. The interiors weren't cheap, but they also weren't expensive. So it was a very middle of the range car. It was just very niche. People that bought them, they basically only bought them because they trust Toyota, and obviously they knew it was going to be reliable because it was a Toyota. But why would you spend that extra 10, 15 grand on an Orion when you could just buy a Kluger and you have more space, you have the same engine, and you have the option of all-wheel drive? It didn't really fit into the lineup that well. And the need and want for a V6 sort of tapered off when hybrids started getting more popular. Camry started coming out with hybrids and even RAV4s and Klugers. So unfortunately, the Orion was killed off in 2017. And like I said before, there wasn't really a need for a V6 sedan. So that's why it didn't sell that well. But nevertheless, it's a great car.